Ladies and gentlemen, there was a time when they told you to stay quiet, to endure, to accept what was happening without complaint as if your suffering was an inconvenience rather than a reality. You waited for someone to notice, to step in, to acknowledge the weight of your struggles. But silence was easier for them. It always is for those who do not bear the cost. They let you suffer quietly, believing their inaction had no consequence. They dismissed your warnings, ignored your pain, and walked away when standing by you required courage. But life does not grant immunity to those who refuse responsibility. And now, the consequences are no longer whispers in the dark. They are loud. They are undeniable. They demand to be heard. Reality does not negotiate. The truth, suppressed for too long, will return like a storm. A company that ignores its workers' needs will face collapse. A leader who silences dissent will one day hear the voices of rebellion. A friend who betrays your trust will find themselves abandoned when they need loyalty most. This is not revenge. This is the natural order of things. You bore the weight of suffering in silence. You believed that enduring it made you stronger, and in some ways it did. But strength does not mean accepting injustice indefinitely. It means knowing when the time has come to speak, not with anger, but with certainty. Because the world listens when the consequences arrive. And now they must face what they chose to ignore. So stand firm. Let the weight of truth be heard, not for vengeance, but for justice, not to destroy, but to rebuild. Because those who suffered in silence deserve a voice. And today, life has given them one. The cost of complicity. There is a price to be paid for ignoring the truth. It does not vanish simply because it is inconvenient. It lingers, grows, and festers in the shadows until reality forces its way into the light. Complicity in suffering is not a passive act. It is an active choice, one that carries weight and consequence. When someone is suffering and the world looks the other way, what message does that send? It tells the suffering individual that their pain is irrelevant, that their struggles are beneath acknowledgement. It tells them that silence is preferable to discomfort, that their cries for help are disruptions rather than calls for justice. But here's the reality. Ignoring suffering does not erase it. It simply delays its reckoning. When institutions neglect their people, they create the conditions for collapse. When families turn a blind eye to dysfunction, they set the stage for generational trauma. When individuals suppress their pain, pretending all is well, they do not heal. They fracture internally until the break becomes visible to all. Take, for example, the workplace, where overworked employees are told to push through exhaustion. At first, the silence is tolerable. They bear it, believing that perseverance is their duty. But as time passes, productivity declines, resentment builds. A breaking point arrives. Suddenly, those who once worked in silence refuse to give more. The company wonders why morale has plummeted, why turnover is high, why its foundation is crumbling. The answer is simple. It ignored the quiet suffering for too long. Now, the consequences are deafening. Or consider the personal relationships where one partner carries the emotional weight while the other remains oblivious. At first, the burdened individual tells themselves it is temporary, that things will improve. But over time, the neglect becomes a pattern, the silence an expectation. And then, one day, the silence is broken, not in a gentle discussion, but in a rupture, a moment when all the unspoken words come pouring out. The neglector is stunned. They did not see it coming, but they should have. The warnings were always there. They just chose to ignore them. Complicity in suffering is not just about grand injustices. It exists in the everyday moments when people refuse to act. The bystander who witnesses bullying and says nothing. the friend who notices someone's distress but assumes someone else will step in, the leader who knows change is needed but fears disruption more than stagnation. Each of these decisions may feel small in the moment, but their collective weight is immense. And here is the ultimate truth: reality will not remain silent forever. It may allow the illusion of control for a time, but the consequences of avoidance are inevitable. The longer suffering is ignored, the more forcefully it will demand to be addressed. And when that moment arrives, those who looked away will have no defense. So, what is the alternative? It is simple but not easy. It requires courage, the courage to listen, to acknowledge, to intervene when necessary. It means recognizing that comfort should not come at the expense of another's well-being. It means understanding that silence in the face of suffering is not neutrality, it is participation. When people tell you their struggles, hear them. When you see injustice, do not turn away. When life gives you the chance to stand on the right side of truth, take it. Because in the end, the cost of complicity is far greater than the discomfort of confrontation. And the longer you delay, the louder the reckoning will be. The weight of silent endurance. Suffering in silence is often mistaken for strength. People believe that enduring pain without complaint is a virtue, that pushing through hardship alone is a sign of resilience. Society praises those who carry their burdens quietly, as if voicing pain is a weakness rather than a call for justice. But the truth is, silence does not erase suffering, it compounds it. There is a dangerous expectation placed upon those who suffer. They are told to be patient, to persevere, to endure quietly, because things will get better. But better for whom? Better for those who benefit from their silence? Better for those who do not have to feel uncomfortable by acknowledging someone else's pain? Pain, when left unspoken, does not disappear. It seeps into the fabric of a person's being, shaping their perceptions, altering their confidence, and redefining their sense of worth. The unspoken words, the suppressed emotions, the swallowed pleas for help, they do not vanish, they remain, and over time they manifest in ways no one can ignore. Consider the individual who has spent years being overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued. At first, they tolerate it. They convince themselves it is temporary, that if they work harder, prove themselves more, or simply wait, their struggles will be acknowledged. But time passes, and nothing changes. Their silence was not a strategy. It was a trap. And then, one day, the silence breaks, not in a whisper, but in a roar. It may come in the form of a resignation letter from an overworked employee who gave everything and received nothing in return. It may appear as the collapse of a once stable relationship, where years of quiet resentment finally spill into an irreversible divide. It may even manifest as a personal reckoning, where the individual who endured too much for too long walks away not out of anger, but out of necessity. The world is shocked in these moments. Why didn't they say anything, they ask? Why didn't they speak up sooner? But the reality is, they did. Perhaps not in words, but in actions, in expressions, in subtle signs that were ignored. The weight of silent endurance is not proof of resilience. It is evidence of neglect, and there is an even greater danger: the false belief that those who suffer silently will remain silent forever. This is where the world miscalculates. Because when the suffering becomes too great, when the weight is unbearable, silence does not simply continue, it erupts. And when it does, the consequences are deafening. This is why listening matters, why recognizing the signs before the breaking point is crucial, why no one should ever be expected to endure in silence simply because it is more convenient for those around them. Suffering in silence is not noble. It is not an act of heroism. It is a warning. And if ignored for too long, that warning will turn into something the world can no longer ignore. The loudness of reality. Reality does not negotiate. It does not wait for permission to reveal itself, nor does it soften its impact to protect those who ignored its warnings. When the truth has been buried for too long, when suffering has been dismissed, and when responsibility has been avoided, reality does what it always does. It arrives loudly, undeniably, and without mercy. For those who chose silence over action, this moment often feels sudden. A company that disregarded its workers' needs is shocked when a mass resignation cripples its operations. A leader who ignored the concerns of their people is blindsided when their authority is rejected. A person who failed to nurture their relationships is heartbroken when those closest to them walk away. But none of these outcomes were sudden. They were years in the making, growing beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer contain them. The world often believes that problems can be postponed, that consequences can be delayed indefinitely, but this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how reality works. The cost of avoidance does not disappear, it accumulates, and when the final reckoning arrives, it does not come gently. Think of the neglected bridge that eventually collapses. The cracks were there long before the disaster, but they were dismissed as minor, unimportant, something to deal with later. Then one day, the weight becomes too much, and what could have been prevented becomes irreversible. This is not just an engineering failure, it is a metaphor for life itself. In personal struggles, this pattern repeats. A person suppresses their emotions, believing they can endure indefinitely. They convince themselves that if they just hold on a little longer, things will improve. But suppression is not healing. It is not resilience. It is a slow, silent erosion that continues until the inevitable collapse. And when it happens, those around them will say, "I had no idea," but the signs were always there. The same applies to society. When corruption is ignored, when injustices are tolerated, when fundamental issues are dismissed as inconveniences, the outcome is never peace. It is only a delay of the inevitable, a temporary silence before the explosion. History has proven this over and over again. What is ignored does not disappear. It only grows stronger until it is impossible to overlook. So why do people continue to believe they can outrun reality? Because silence is comfortable, because acknowledging a problem means taking responsibility for it. And responsibility requires effort, change, and sometimes sacrifice. But the alternative, the deafening arrival of consequences, is always far worse. The truth is this: reality does not care about convenience. It does not wait for people to be ready. It enforces the laws of cause and effect without bias. And those who ignore this will eventually find themselves at the mercy of a truth they refuse to face. If you are suffering, understand this: your pain is not invisible. It is not something you must endure in silence forever. Reality has a way of amplifying what is suppressed, of turning whispers into undeniable echoes. And when the time comes, those who let you suffer quietly will no longer be able to ignore the sound of their own consequences. The moral cost of indifference. There is no such thing as neutral ground when it comes to suffering. The moment you witness pain and choose to do nothing, you have taken a side. Indifference is not the absence of action. It is an action in itself, one that carries a moral cost far greater than most people are willing to acknowledge. We live in a world where it is often easier to look away than to confront. People see injustice, but tell themselves it is not their problem. They witness suffering but convince themselves someone else will step in. They watch as a person struggles, but because it is uncomfortable to acknowledge, they remain silent. The justification is always the same. It's not my business. It's not my responsibility. But what happens when this mindset becomes the norm, when people collectively decide that suffering is someone else's problem? The answer is simple. It grows, it spreads, it solidifies into something that no longer affects just one person, but entire communities, entire systems, entire generations. History is filled with moments where indifference led to catastrophe. Corrupt leaders were allowed to rise because people remained silent in the early days of their power. Workers were exploited because those who noticed said nothing. Families collapsed because issues that could have been addressed were ignored for too long. It is never the loudest wrongdoers who create the most damage. It is the silent majority who allow them to continue unchecked. But here is the truth. Ignoring suffering does not absolve anyone from its consequences. It simply postpones them. And when they arrive, they do not just affect those who are ignored, they come for those who refuse to act as well. Consider the friend who sees another spiraling but says nothing. They believe they are staying out of it, respecting boundaries, avoiding unnecessary involvement. But when that person reaches a breaking point, when their suffering turns into self-destruction, regret sets in. I should have said something. I should have done more. The cost of indifference is now personal. Or look at a workplace where toxic behavior is tolerated. Employees watch as colleagues are mistreated, but they do not intervene. They tell themselves they cannot risk their own position. But soon, that toxicity spreads. It reaches them. What was once someone else's problem is now their reality. Indifference is a temporary shield, but it is never a permanent escape. Reality ensures that. So what is the alternative? It is not about becoming a savior. It is not about taking on every battle. It is simply about choosing to care, to speak when silence is expected, to acknowledge suffering rather than dismiss it, to recognize that every moment of inaction is a decision and every decision has consequences. Because one day it will not be someone else suffering, it will be you. And in that moment, you will hope that the world does not choose indifference. Rising from the ruins. Suffering, when endured for too long, transforms a person. It sharpens their awareness, deepens their understanding, and hardens their resolve. But there comes a moment when suffering is no longer just something to endure. It becomes something to rise from. Because while pain can break a person, it can also remake them. For years, they let you suffer quietly. They dismissed your struggles, invalidated your concerns, and continued as if your endurance had no limit. They assumed your silence meant submission, that you would always carry the weight alone. But what they failed to realize is that suffering is not a bottomless well. It has a threshold, and when that threshold is reached, something shifts. You've seen this before. The employee who gave everything to a company that exploited them, until one day they walked away and the company crumbled without them. The person who endured a toxic relationship for years, until one day they left, taking their loyalty, kindness, and strength with them. The individual who was ridiculed, underestimated, ignored, until one day they rebuilt themselves into someone who could no longer be dismissed. The world acts shocked when this happens. They changed, they say. They became someone else. But the truth is, you did not become someone else. You became who you were always meant to be, once freed from the burden of silent suffering. There is something powerful about hitting the point where you refuse to carry what is not yours anymore. The day you decide that your worth is not up for debate. that your voice will not be silenced, that your energy will no longer be spent on those who refuse to value it. This is not revenge. It is not about proving anyone wrong. It is about reclaiming yourself. Because suffering may have shaped you, but it does not define you. What defines you is what you do after, the person you build, the life you create, the boundaries you set, and the wisdom you carry forward. And perhaps the greatest irony is this: the same people who let you suffer quietly will be the loudest when they realize what they have lost. But by then it will not matter, because you will have risen from the ruins they left you in. And this time, the only voice that matters will be your own.